I'll never forget that night. It was just an ordinary evening, or at least I thought it would be. I was driving through the desolate stretch of highway, the kind that goes on for miles with no signs of civilization, just endless darkness and the occasional flicker of a distant light. I had been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy, my body aching from the long drive. I wasn't too far from the next town, but I needed to stretch my legs and fill up my tank, so when I saw a lone gas station in the distance, I decided to pull in. The station seemed deserted, and I wasn't surprised. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I wasn't expecting much company. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed something strange. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows over the empty lot. The gas station looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the pump was working, and that's all I needed. I was desperate to get back on the road. I walked up to the building to pay. The glass door creaked open, and I was immediately hit with a musty smell that made my stomach turn. The store was dimly lit, with outdated shelves stacked with dusty cans of soda and chips. The counter was empty, no sign of anyone behind it. I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy. The place just didn't sit right with me. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where time had frozen and no one had been around for ages. That's when I heard it. A faint voice like someone was whispering from the back of the store. My heart skipped a beat, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or the hum of the old refrigerator. But the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was several, all talking over each other in a low, unintelligible murmur. I walked cautiously toward the back of the store, hoping to find some sign of life. That's when I saw him. An old man, hunched over a table, staring blankly at a row of empty chairs. His clothes were ragged, and his face was pale, as though he hadn't seen the sun in years. He didn't move when I approached, not even when I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, trying to get his attention. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the chairs, his expression vacant. I took a step back, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard the whispering again. This time it was clearer. The voices were almost pleading. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an undeniable sense of desperation in the air. I glanced back at the old man who was now standing, still staring at the chairs. Something wasn't right. I knew it then. Something had happened here. Something dark and twisted. I walked back toward the pump, determined to leave as quickly as possible. But when I reached my car, I saw him standing outside, watching me from the shadows. His eyes were wide open now, filled with fear, and his mouth moved as if he was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. I started the car and drove off, my heart racing. As I sped down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gas station lights in the distance, but there was nothing, just the blackness of the road stretching ahead. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I had left something behind at that gas station. Something I shouldn't have. As I finally neared the next town, I saw a sign for a rest area and decided to stop and take a break. I needed to clear my head. I pulled into the parking lot, got out of the car, and stretched my legs. The cool night air felt refreshing, and for a moment I thought maybe the strange events at the gas station had been a product of exhaustion. But then I saw it. A figure standing near the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. It was a man, his back to me. He stood perfectly still, as though waiting for something. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. Then the man turned, and I saw his face. It was the old man from the gas station. His eyes were wide, filled with a terror I couldn't comprehend. He opened his mouth, and for the first time I heard him speak. "They're coming for you," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "They won't stop until they get you." Before I could respond, the man vanished, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow. I stood there, too stunned to move, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed back to my car and sped away, but no matter how fast I drove, the feeling of being hunted never left me. The next day, I told myself it was just a bad dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's warning was real, that the darkness of that gas station had followed me home. Over the following weeks, I kept hearing whispers in the dead of night. At first, they were faint, like echoes from a far-off place. But soon they became louder. Sometimes I could almost hear someone knocking at my door, only to find no one there when I opened it. And then the nightmares started. Every night, I would dream of the gas station. It was always the same: the flickering lights, the abandoned shelves, and the old man staring at the empty chairs. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others with him, people whose faces were twisted with pain and fear, their mouths open in silent screams. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The gas station, that place of darkness, had gotten inside me, and it wasn't going to let go. One night after another sleepless stretch, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I didn't know why, but I needed to confront whatever was haunting me. I drove back to that desolate stretch of highway, the same route I had taken that night. When I reached the gas station, I saw it standing there, just as it had before. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows over the lot. I parked my car and walked up to the store, my heart heavy with dread. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the same musty stench I remembered. And then I saw him, standing in the back, just like before. The old man, he turned slowly, his face pale and worn, his eyes filled with an unimaginable sadness. He reached out a trembling hand, and for the first time I understood. He wasn't here to warn me anymore. He was here to join the others. I heard the whispers again, louder now, coming from every direction. They weren't just voices, they were the voices of the lost, of those who had been claimed by this cursed place. And I realized with a sickening feeling in my gut that I was no longer just a visitor. I had become one of them. The gas station had claimed me. And now, it was my turn to wait, to whisper.
Next story.
I'm not sure if I can ever explain what happened that night. I've told myself 1,000 times it was just a weird coincidence or a trick of the mind, but something inside me knows that it was far worse than that. It started when I was driving through the middle of nowhere in western Texas, around 2 in the morning. The road stretched for miles in front of me with nothing but flat fields and the occasional rusted-out shack. I had been on the road for hours, and my gas gauge was nearing empty. I wasn't worried, though. I knew that eventually I'd run across a gas station, but I hadn't seen one in at least an hour, and the fuel light was now blinking in my face. The sun had set hours ago, and the headlights of my car felt like the only thing separating me from the vast, suffocating blackness. That's when I saw the lights in the distance. It looked like a gas station. I almost couldn't believe my luck. Another mile, and I'd be able to fill up and grab something to drink. As I got closer, I noticed the gas station was old. The pumps were the kind with the vintage dials, and the building itself seemed to be falling apart. It didn't look like any place I would have chosen to stop on a normal day, but desperate times and all. Besides, I figured it was just a small, lonely spot on the side of the road, nothing to be afraid of. I pulled into the lot and shut off the engine. The air smelled like dust and oil, and the neon sign above flickered. It wasn't the welcoming kind of place you'd expect. There was something off about it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The pumps were in terrible condition, as if they hadn't been used in years. I tried to put my card in, but it was so old that the machine barely reacted. I got out of my car to go inside and ask if they could fix the pump, or at least let me pay at the counter. The door creaked as I stepped inside. It was dark and smelled faintly of mildew. A weak, buzzing light hung from the ceiling, illuminating a counter that had a few candy bars and dirty coffee mugs scattered on it. The station looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades, and there was something unsettling about the whole place. But at this point, I was too tired to care. I approached the counter, and the man behind it didn't immediately look up. He was tall and thin, with a greasy mop of black hair and an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His hands trembled as he wiped the counter, and I could see the lines of age and wear on his face. But it wasn't the man's looks that made my stomach turn. It was the silence. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding oddly loud in the empty room. "The pump outside isn't working. Can you help me out?" He didn't reply. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. His eyes were glassy, distant, almost like he wasn't really seeing me at all. "Fuel's out back," he muttered, his voice low and raspy. "Around the side." I nodded, uneasy but trying to push past the weirdness. I thanked him and stepped back outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I shivered as I walked around the corner of the building. The gas pumps behind the station were even older than the ones at the front, and there were cracks in the concrete. As I pulled the nozzle from the pump and started to fill up, I noticed something strange. There was a set of tire tracks leading into the dirt behind the station, tracks that seemed to disappear into the darkness. They weren't from my car. My tires were clean. These tracks looked like they'd been made by a heavy vehicle, and they headed straight toward the forest at the edge of the property. I shook it off as just another oddity of the area, but the silence felt suffocating. There was no wind, no sound at all, except for the soft click of the gas nozzle. Suddenly, I heard something. A low, guttural noise that came from somewhere deep in the woods behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The trees loomed dark and still. My mind was racing. I could have sworn I heard something moving, something large and heavy, but I couldn't see anything. I finished pumping the gas, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I quickly moved back toward my car, and just as I reached for the door handle, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing. There, standing at the corner of the building, was a figure. It was the man from inside the station. His face was shadowed, but I could make out his eyes, wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. I stared at him, frozen, as he slowly began to walk toward me. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaking. "I can help, if you..." The man didn't answer. Instead, he kept coming toward me, dragging his feet along the dirt, making no effort to move quickly. It was like he was being pulled forward against his will. I started backing away, my breath coming faster now. My brain was telling me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Every step he took seemed deliberate, slow, like he was drawing me in. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man stopped. He stood there in the darkness, not moving, just staring. The silence was deafening. "Is this what you want?" he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But it wasn't his voice that terrified me. It was the way the words echoed, like there was something else speaking through him. I turned and ran without a second thought. I didn't even look back to see if he was still there. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door handle, and when I finally got inside, I slammed the car into drive. I didn't even bother to check if the gas was full. I sped off, my heart hammering in my chest, my thoughts racing. My mind kept going back to the words the man had spoken. "Is this what you want?" The road stretched out in front of me, but it felt like no matter how fast I drove, I wasn't getting any closer to safety. The darkness outside seemed to close in, the trees pressing against the road, and I could still hear the low rumble from the woods behind me. But the worst part came a few miles down the road. I glanced into my rearview mirror, and I swear I saw the lights of a car following me. It wasn't bright, and it wasn't steady, but it was there. For a moment, I thought it might be the man from the gas station, but the car wasn't like his old, beat-up truck. This one had modern headlights, and the shape of it was too clean. I drove faster. I didn't look back, but the lights kept following, getting closer. When I finally reached a town, I stopped at a small diner to collect myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The waitress who served me breakfast barely looked at me, but when she did, there was something about her gaze that sent a chill down my spine. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and distant. I nodded quickly, trying to sound normal. "Yeah, just a rough night." "You shouldn't have stopped at that gas station," she said quietly. "They say it's haunted. People who stop there, they don't always leave." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "What do you mean?" "The station's been closed for years. The owner died a long time ago. But sometimes, late at night, you'll see people standing outside, like they're waiting for someone. People who were there before. People who don't leave." I didn't know what to say. As I got up to leave, I couldn't help but glance out the window. The diner sat on a quiet corner, but in the distance, I saw something, just a flash of light. A car turning off the main road toward the gas station, the same one. I didn't stick around to find out more.
Next story.
It was a normal night, just another late shift at a gas station off a busy highway in Pennsylvania. I was working the graveyard shift, a job I'd taken after moving into town. The night was quiet, and there wasn't much to do but watch the clock and occasionally help someone with a refill or snack. But something about this night felt different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Around midnight, a car pulled up to the pump. It wasn't unusual for someone to stop at this hour, but this car stood out. It was an old sedan, dark green and covered in a layer of dirt. The windows were tinted so heavily I couldn't see inside, and it was the kind of car that made you do a double take. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. I didn't know why, but my stomach twisted. The driver didn't get out right away. The car sat there for a minute, idling, before I saw the shadow of someone moving behind the wheel. They leaned forward to grab the pump handle, but I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, just a dark figure. There was no one else around. The place was practically deserted. I tried not to stare, but something pulled my attention back to the car. The person was filling up slowly, almost too slowly, like they had all the time in the world. I noticed the lights flickering in the station, a strange strobe effect that was unsettling. I stood at the counter, wondering if the lights were just malfunctioning. Maybe the wiring was old. Then, just as I was about to look away, I heard something, a faint sound like a whispering voice. It wasn't coming from the car, it was coming from inside the station. I froze. I was sure I was alone. I hadn't heard anyone come in. But there it was, a soft voice, distant and unintelligible. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The store was dark, except for the light over the counter, but I could swear I saw movement. I couldn't make it out, but it was as though someone had walked past the aisles, like a shadow darting by. The hairs on my neck stood up. I'd worked plenty of late shifts before, but this felt different. I was used to the loneliness, but tonight the silence felt heavy, suffocating. I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe the stress was getting to me. I took a deep breath and grabbed the phone to check the time. When I looked up, the figure from the car was standing in front of the door, just staring at me through the glass. I couldn't see their face, just a dark silhouette, still as a statue. I couldn't bring myself to go outside. My legs felt like lead. It was like some primal instinct was telling me not to move. But I had to. I didn't want to lose my job over something this weird. Slowly, I walked to the door, heart racing in my chest. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It was like it didn't even hear me. My hand reached for the door handle, but the moment I touched it, the figure stepped back. I froze. I couldn't explain it, but that single movement, just the way it backed away, slow and deliberate, sent a chill through my entire body. I was about to open the door, but I hesitated. Something in the back of my mind screamed at me not to do it. I glanced around the station, half expecting someone else to walk in, but there was no one. I looked back at the car. It was still there, parked at the pump, but now the driver was gone. It didn't make sense. I was sure I saw the figure at the door, but now the car was completely empty. The whispering sound came back, this time louder, almost like it was coming from all around me. The air felt colder, heavier. My breath came out in little clouds. I grabbed the phone and started dialing the number for my manager. But before I could hit send, the door to the store swung open with a loud bang. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, expecting to see a customer or maybe the figure from outside. But there was no one. The door had just opened by itself. I was shaking. There was no reason for the door to swing open like that. I'd been standing right there. My hands were clammy, but I stepped forward, my instincts telling me to investigate, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispering grew louder, like a chorus of voices. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped. The silence was deafening. My phone buzzed in my hand, breaking the tension. I looked down. It was a text from my manager. "Hey, how's everything going? I'll be back in 20 minutes. I quickly typed back, not sure what to say. Something's wrong here. The door opened by itself. And there's no one in the station. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Just as I hit send, the lights flickered again. This time, they went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight under the counter, my hands trembling as I turned it on. In the flickering light, I could make out shapes moving in the back of the store, dark, shadowy forms that seemed to slide along the aisles almost like they were floating. My pulse hammered in my ears. There was no way this was happening. My eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figures kept moving and the whispers started up again. I could feel them getting closer. I stumbled backward, knocking over a can of soda from the counter. It hit the floor with a loud thud. The shadows froze. Then one of them moved. Closer, closer until it was right in front of me. It was an empty, hollow shape, an outline of a person with no features, no face. I screamed, but the sound didn't come out right. It was like it was swallowed by the darkness. The shadow reached out a hand, and in the instant it touched me, I felt the coldest chill run through my veins. It was like nothing I'd ever felt. It wasn't just cold. It was ancient. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs were stiff, my body frozen in place. The shadow didn't say anything. It didn't need to. It just stood there, its presence so heavy that I felt like I was suffocating under its weight. Suddenly, the lights came back on. I gasped for breath. The shadows were gone. The car outside was gone. The door was closed. It was like nothing had ever happened. But I knew it had. I wasn't imagining it. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my bag, ran outside, and locked the door behind me. I didn't care if I was leaving the station open or not. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there. When my manager showed up 20 minutes later, he found me sitting on the curb, pale and shaking. I didn't tell him what happened. How could I? I never worked another night shift at that gas station. I couldn't. I quit the next day. But I still think about that night, about the car, the shadow, and the whispers. And sometimes when I'm driving down that same stretch of highway late at night, I swear I see the lights of that old green sedan in my rearview mirror, but when I glance back, there's nothing there.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts. At least, I didn't until that night. The kind of job I had was the sort that let you pass the hours thinking about everything and nothing. Sitting in a gas station in the middle of nowhere, pumping gas, cleaning the counter, and occasionally helping out the odd customer. The nights were always the quietest, and it suited me fine. There was something oddly comforting about being alone with the hum of the lights and the sound of tires on the road. That night, though, something was different. I'd been working at the station for about 3 months, just enough time to get used to the rhythms of the place. The shifts were uneventful for the most part, save for the occasional drunk driver, trucker stopping for a quick break, or some late-night traveler. Most of the people who came by were tired and just wanted to get back on the road. Around 2 a.m., when things were normally at their quietest, a car pulled up. It was a white old sedan, beat up and covered in a thin layer of dust, with the kind of headlights that barely illuminated the lot. I noticed the car right away. Something about it seemed off. It wasn't the car itself. It was the way it moved. It pulled into the station slowly, the engine sputtering, and then it just sat there, idling as if waiting for something. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the driver just needed a moment to get out. I figured I'd go check the pump and offer to help, but the longer I stared at the car, the more uncomfortable I felt. I couldn't see the driver's face. It was obscured by the tinted windows, but I could feel their eyes on me. It was the strangest sensation. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. After what felt like forever, the driver finally stepped out. He was a tall man, hunched slightly, dressed in a faded brown jacket, and had a ragged look to him. He didn't look like a traveler who'd just pulled off the highway. He looked tired, worn down. His face was pale, his skin almost gray, and there was something strange about his eyes. His gaze was distant, unblinking, as though he wasn't really seeing me at all. It was like he was staring straight through me. "Can I help you with something?" I called out as I stepped forward, trying to shake off the chill creeping down my spine. The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, still, staring. I felt uneasy, but I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe I had interrupted his thoughts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he muttered something under his breath, barely audible. "Fuel. Please." I nodded and walked over to the pump, reaching for the nozzle, though my hand was trembling. The whole situation felt wrong. I tried to brush it off as a normal customer, but as I filled his tank, I couldn't stop glancing over at him. He hadn't moved. His posture was stiff, unnatural, and he hadn't even looked at the car. His eyes were fixed on something else entirely. It was as if he didn't even need the fuel. He just wanted to stay here in this moment. I finished filling up his tank and went to offer him the total. The man didn't say a word. He just stood there, not moving, until I walked up to him. $35.50, I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice wavered. The man finally looked at me, and when he did, I almost stepped back. His face, it wasn't right. His eyes were too wide, his skin too pale. His lips were drawn tight, like he was forcing a smile. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my throat dry. He opened his mouth, but instead of speaking, he let out a low, rattling breath, like something caught in his chest, something unnatural. I could hear it deep in my bones, vibrating through the air. For a split second, I thought I saw his lips curl up into something that resembled a grin, but it wasn't a friendly one. It looked like something worse. I need to go, I muttered, suddenly desperate to get away. The man didn't respond. He just stood there like he was waiting for me to leave. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to look away, pretending everything was fine. I turned to go inside, but as I did, I heard a sound behind me, something like dragging footsteps. I whipped around, half expecting to see him walking toward the door, but the man hadn't moved. His car was still there, idling, and the headlights cast long shadows across the lot. But something was different. The air felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a sharp chill run down my spine. A dread I couldn't shake settled over me like a weight. I turned back to the counter, wiping my hands on my apron, trying to calm myself. Then the door to the station swung open with a creak. It was a sound I'd heard 1,000 times, but this time it sounded different. The air inside grew colder. The man, who I was sure had been outside moments ago, was standing right in front of me. My blood ran cold. The man had crossed the entire parking lot in the span of a few seconds without me hearing anything. His face was even paler than before, and his eyes seemed to glow now, like they were reflecting something inside the room. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring. "Please, leave," I managed to stammer, trying to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He held it out to me. I didn't want to take it, but I couldn't help myself. My hand reached for the picture, almost as if I was being drawn to it. I grabbed the photo and looked down at it, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. The photo was of a family, a woman and a young boy, both smiling in front of a house. They looked normal, but the more I stared at it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. The woman's smile didn't seem quite real. It was too wide, too forced, and the boy's eyes, his eyes were completely black, hollow. I looked up at the man, my mouth dry. "What is this?" He didn't answer. His smile grew wider. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was something dark, twisted. Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back, and as I stared after him, I noticed something else. The car. It was gone. There wasn't even a trace of it. It had disappeared into thin air. I stood there in shock for what felt like an eternity. Then I turned to the photograph in my hands again. But when I looked down at it, I could see that the boy's eyes were no longer black. They were looking directly at me. He was staring right at me through the photo, his smile wide and empty. I couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The door creaked open again, and when I turned, the man was standing in the threshold, looking at me with those hollow, glowing eyes. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The shadows in the station grew darker, and I knew then that I was not alone. I dropped the photograph and ran out the back door. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road. When I finally found a gas station with lights on, I called my manager and told him everything. I never went back to that station. No one ever worked the graveyard shift again. As for the photograph, I left it behind, but sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear that man's breath. And sometimes I can feel the boy's eyes on me.
Next story.
I remember it like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget. It was the kind of night that seemed ordinary at first. Clouds hanging heavy, the wind pushing through the trees, and the dull hum of the highway stretching on for miles. I had been driving for hours, the needle on my gas gauge creeping closer and closer to empty, and there wasn't a single sign of a gas station in sight. Not a soul on the road, just me, my car, and the endless stretch of asphalt. By the time I spotted the lights of a gas station flickering in the distance, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The station stood on the side of the road, isolated, with a single old-fashioned pump. There were no cars, no other drivers in sight. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, except the lights were on. I thought nothing of it at first. I pulled up to the pump, and before I even got out of the car, I noticed the flicker in the station's window, like someone was moving inside. It was strange, but at that point, I was too tired to care. I needed gas, and I was hoping for a quick stop. When I stepped out of the car, a gust of cold wind rushed past me, making me shiver. I looked up at the old, cracked sign above the station. It had a faded logo that looked like something from the 70s, and the name of the station was almost unreadable. But I didn't think much of it. After all, there was a working pump, and I wasn't about to drive on fumes any longer. The door to the station creaked open as I approached. The interior smelled musty, a mixture of old oil and something else that made my stomach churn. Behind the counter, a man stood, though his features were barely distinguishable in the dim light. He wore a dirty, worn-out uniform, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The man didn't speak, just stared at me for a moment. Can I get $20 on pump number 1? I asked, trying to sound casual. The man nodded slowly but didn't move. I stood there awkwardly, waiting for him to respond. He didn't. It was as though he hadn't heard me. After a long, uncomfortable silence, I turned to go back to my car. That's when I noticed something strange. The shadows in the station seemed to move. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But no, there were figures in the corners. Figures that didn't belong. They were dark, almost too dark to be cast by the dim lights. And they weren't still. They seemed to shift and twitch. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, they were gone. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I shook it off and walked back to the pump, trying to ignore the creeping unease in my chest. As I filled the tank, I couldn't help but glance back at the station. The man was still standing at the counter, staring out at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I quickly finished fueling, eager to leave. But as I started to get back in my car, something stopped me. A sound, a low, scraping noise like metal on concrete came from behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the empty station. The man was gone. I didn't hear the door open or close, but somehow, he was just gone. The wind picked up again, and I got in the car, locking the door. I put the car in gear, ready to get away from the strange gas station. But as I pulled out of the station's lot and onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw him. The man was standing in the middle of the road, just far enough back that I could make out his silhouette. His wide-brimmed hat and shadowed face were still visible, but his body, his posture, was wrong. His arms hung too long, almost reaching the ground. His head was tilted at an odd angle, like his neck was broken. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, but when I turned the wheel to avoid him, he didn't move. I swerved, the tires screeching, and the car lurched to the side of the road. I hit the brakes hard, coming to a sudden stop just a few feet away from the shoulder. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my breath shallow and quick. I looked up at the road again, but the man, he was gone. I didn't wait to see if he'd reappear. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, so I shifted the car into drive and sped off. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The darkness outside seemed to press in on me, the road narrowing and twisting in ways it hadn't before. The night felt heavier, suffocating. I don't know how long I drove before I noticed something strange. The trees on the side of the road began to look off. Their shadows were too long, too twisted, and they seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the car. And then as I drove, the signs began to blur. I passed the same mile marker 3 times. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. I was alone. But I couldn't shake the sense that I was trapped. The road ahead seemed endless, looping back on itself, and the same gas station, flickering lights and all, appeared again in the distance. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. But there it was. I pulled up to the same station, the same pump, the same old man standing behind the counter. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and knowing. I got out of the car, heart pounding, knowing I had no choice but to face whatever was happening. As I approached the door, it swung open on its own. The strange figure inside watched me with unblinking eyes. "You can't leave." The man's voice rasped from behind his hat, the words barely above a whisper. His lips didn't move. I could feel it, though, in the air, a vibration, like the whole world was in sync with his voice. "What do you mean?" My voice was weak, barely audible. My legs felt like they were made of stone. "You can't leave. Not yet. You've already stayed too long," he murmured. I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak, my entire body trembling with terror. The station, the man, the eerie atmosphere, it all began to press in on me, suffocating me. And then the shadows moved again, but this time they didn't stay in the corners. They crept toward me, as though they had a life of their own, reaching out like claws, like tendrils, as though they could pull me into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me faded, the station and the man slowly dissolving into blackness. And then, nothing. The next thing I remember, I was back in my car, speeding down the highway once more. I looked at the rearview mirror and there was nothing behind me. No gas station, no strange figures, just the empty, dark road stretching on. But I know the truth. I'm not really free. That place, it still haunts me. The gas station, the man, the shadows, they're still there somewhere waiting. And if I ever go back, if I ever make the mistake of turning that corner again, I won't make it out. I'll be stuck in that loop forever, just like all the others. The road will never end.
Next story.
It was a night just like any other. I had just finished my shift at the 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town, and as I locked up for the night, the wind howled through the trees. The air was cool, crisp, perfect for a long, lonely drive home. I'd worked nights for years, and it never really bothered me. The gas station wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. I had my routine down, and the few customers who came by were usually in and out quickly. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt wrong. I had been working the graveyard shift when he showed up. An older man, maybe in his late 50s. He pulled into the parking lot in a rusty pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. The headlights flickered for a second before he shut the engine off and stepped out of the truck. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I looked up from the counter, I saw him standing there, staring at the station. His posture was off, like he was trying to figure something out, or like he didn't belong here. He had the kind of face that would make anyone feel uneasy. Thin lips, hollow cheeks, and eyes that seemed too wide, like he was looking past you. He was dressed in an old, worn-out jacket that looked like it was about to fall apart, and his shoes were caked in dirt. It wasn't the kind of man you expected to be wandering around in the middle of the night at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. He finally approached the door, and I greeted him as I always did. "Can I help you?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at me for a moment, his eyes shifting unnaturally as if he were trying to read me. It was a long, uncomfortable silence. When he spoke, it was in a slow, deliberate voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "I need gas." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. "Okay, I'll take care of that for you." I stepped outside to start the pump, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I walked back inside, not thinking much of it. It wasn't uncommon for people to take their time. The wind outside started to pick up, rattling the windows as I turned back to the counter. My hands were shaking slightly as I folded the receipts, trying to distract myself from the growing tension in the air. Then, just as I was about to look up, the bell on the door chimed. I glanced over, expecting to see the man coming back in to pay for his gas. But he wasn't there. Instead, the door opened slightly, just enough to see the outside. And standing there just outside the door was a figure. It wasn't the man from the truck. This figure was much taller, wearing a large coat that covered most of their body, with a hood that obscured their face. They stood perfectly still, just watching. I froze. A cold feeling crept over me, a feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't normal for anyone to just stand there, unmoving. My heart was pounding in my chest. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. There was something wrong with this situation, something I couldn't explain. I stepped closer to the door, trying to get a better look, but the figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. I could barely make out any features, just the outline of their face under the hood. But something about the way they stood there, almost too still, made my blood run cold. Before I could react, the door slammed open, and the man from the truck suddenly appeared behind me. His breath was ragged, like he had been running, though he hadn't been when I last saw him. He was panting, his eyes wild. "Don't look at it," he shouted, his voice hoarse. I didn't know what to make of it, but the urgency in his voice hit me like a ton of bricks. I whipped around to face him, but as I did, the air in the station seemed to grow colder, almost icy. The figure outside was still there, standing in the same position, not moving a muscle. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to step back, my mind racing. The man was shaking his head, his face pale. "It's not real. None of it is real. You can't look at it. You have to look away." I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, caught between the strange figure outside and the frantic man in front of me. My heart was pounding in my ears. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Before I could say anything else, the figure outside moved. It was slow at first, like a puppet with its strings pulled. The hooded figure took one step forward and then another. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and the air seemed to crackle with an oppressive energy. I could feel my chest tighten as it took another step, and I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. My eyes were locked on the figure despite the man's desperate warnings. "Look away," he screamed again, his voice breaking. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my gaze from the thing outside. And then, in an instant, the figure was inside the station. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath in the air. It was like the room itself had turned to ice. The figure was standing just in front of me now, and the air felt thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in my chest. Then, finally, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have looked." The words echoed in my mind long after it stopped speaking. My vision blurred, and I could feel a pressure building in my head, like something was trying to crush me from the inside. I was gasping for air, but it felt like the room was shrinking, like the walls were closing in. Before I could react, the man in front of me moved. He lunged forward, knocking into me and shoving me aside. "Run!" he shouted, but his words felt distant, like they were being drowned out by the ringing in my ears. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and bolted for the door, my legs moving before I could think. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the station, my body shaking from the adrenaline. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind was spinning. I couldn't explain what had happened, what the figure was, or why the man had been so frantic. But one thing was clear. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. And if I'd stayed any longer, I knew I wouldn't have made it out. I never went back to that gas station again, and I never told anyone about what happened that night. No one would have believed me anyway. But sometimes, when I'm driving down that same stretch of road late at night, I swear I see a figure standing in the distance, watching. I've learned my lesson. Some things are better left unseen.
Next story.
I used to work the night shift at a gas station on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the quiet hours gave me time to think. The station was old, run down, and barely maintained. The neon lights flickered and buzzed constantly, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. I didn't mind. It was peaceful. Until that one night. I remember it clearly. It was around 2 a.m. when he pulled in. A lone car, a rusty old sedan that sputtered like it was barely running. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for cars to break down or stop for gas at odd hours. But there was something off about this one. The man who stepped out of the car was tall, hunched over, his face hidden by the brim of a wide hat. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who was far too tired or far too old to be out at this hour. I watched him as he made his way toward the pump, his footsteps dragging on the cracked pavement. He didn't acknowledge me at all. No wave, no nod, nothing. Just silence. I'd been working the same shift for months, and I knew the drill. I greeted every customer, tried to make small talk to pass the time. But this guy, he didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at the pump like it was the only thing in the world worth looking at. I watched him for a few moments, waiting for him to make a move, but he didn't. The station was so quiet, I could hear the faint buzz of the lights above and the low hum of the pump as it automatically started filling his tank. I decided to break the silence. "Everything okay?" I called out. He didn't respond, not at first. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something about the way he stood there made me uneasy. I tried again. "You need any help?" This time, he slowly turned his head toward me. His face was pale, drawn tight like old leather, and his eyes, those eyes were hollow, black as midnight. They didn't seem to reflect any light. They were just empty. "No," he whispered, his voice raspy, almost like he hadn't spoken in years. "I'm just waiting." Waiting. For what? I was taken aback, but before I could ask, he turned back toward the pump. I watched him for a few more seconds, my instincts screaming at me to say something, to do something, anything. But I just stood there. He finished filling up the tank, and then, without a word, he got back in the car and drove off, slowly, like he didn't have anywhere to be. I went back inside the station, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. The whole thing felt off. But that was the last time I saw him, or so I thought. The next night, just as I was about to finish my shift, he came back. Same car, same man, same empty, hollow eyes. I was behind the counter, pretending to be busy when I saw the sedan pull into the lot again. My heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the car rolled to a stop by the pump. I tried to stay calm, but something about the situation felt wrong. I kept my eyes on him as he stepped out of the car. This time, he didn't even bother to look at the pump. He just stood there, staring off into the distance like he was waiting for something or someone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to ask, "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Do you need any help?" He didn't turn around, just stood there, motionless. I was getting scared now. My mind raced, wondering if I should call the cops, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't. Maybe it was just paranoia, but I felt like if I did anything to make him aware of my fear, something terrible would happen. Then, something that made my blood run cold happened. I heard a noise coming from behind the station, a soft shuffle like footsteps dragging across the gravel. It wasn't the man. It was coming from the other side of the building, behind the station, where the storage rooms and the old equipment were kept. I hesitated, but I had to know what it was. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the darkness felt like it was closing in on me. I walked around the corner of the station, shining the flashlight on the ground, the beam cutting through the blackness. The shuffle grew louder as I approached the back of the building, and then just as I turned the corner, I froze. Standing there at the edge of the lot was the same man, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows, I saw something, or someone else. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It was a woman. Her face was obscured, but I could make out the outline of her body, thin and gaunt, her arms outstretched toward the man. She wasn't moving. She just stood there, unmoving, like she was waiting for something. The man didn't acknowledge her presence. He just stared straight ahead, his body rigid. I was too scared to move. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and the darkness seemed to pull me in. I turned my head, trying to look away, but the woman, they, were still there, right in front of me. Suddenly, the man turned toward the woman, and as if on cue, she took a step forward, her body jerking unnaturally. Her feet shuffled across the ground, her movements stiff and mechanical. She made no sound. I could see her face now, gaunt, hollow, eyes wide and black, just like the man's. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. My flashlight fell to the ground, its beam flickering out as I scrambled to my feet. But when I looked back up, they were gone. The lot was empty. I didn't stay to figure out what had just happened. I ran back into the station, locked the door, and sat behind the counter, trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen wasn't just some trick of the light. Those people, those things, they were real. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed in the station, my eyes glued to the security monitors, half expecting to see them again, but they never came back. The rest of my shift passed uneventfully, and when the sun started to rise, I left as quickly as I could. I never returned to that gas station after that night, and when I heard that the station had closed down a few months later, I wasn't surprised. But there's something I can't shake. Something I still hear late at night when the wind howls outside my window. The shuffle of footsteps on gravel, the low whisper of a voice in the dark, and every time I hear it, I can't help but wonder, were they ever really gone?
Next story.
It was late, around 1:30 a.m., when I found myself pulling into a small, rundown gas station just outside of town. The signs on the highway were few and far between, and I'd been driving for what felt like forever, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me with nothing but darkness surrounding me. My gas tank was almost on empty, and there didn't seem to be another stop for miles. So, when I saw the flickering lights of the gas station, I couldn't pass it up. As I pulled in, I immediately felt a sense of unease, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The station looked like it had been there for decades, the pumps old and rusty, the neon sign barely glowing in the dark. I was the only car there, which was strange for such a desolate part of the road. But I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I was tired. I needed gas, and I needed to get back on the road. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the station's small convenience store. The door creaked as I opened it, and the bell above the door let out a soft chime. The inside was just as rundown as the outside. Dim lights, shelves stocked with outdated snacks, and a counter that seemed to have been neglected for years. The clerk, an older man with graying hair and a tired expression, looked up as I entered. "Can I help you?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes seeming to dart around nervously. "I just need to fill up," I said, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. "Of course," he nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he gestured toward the pumps outside. "I'll be right here if you need anything else." I left the store and made my way to the pump. As I started to fill my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was unnervingly still, and I couldn't hear a single sound, not even the hum of the power lines overhead. The night felt too quiet, as if the world had suddenly gone silent just for me. I glanced back at the station and noticed the clerk was still watching me from the window. His gaze was intense, almost unnervingly so, and I felt a sudden chill. Why was he staring at me like that? I turned my attention back to my car, trying to shake off the feeling, but the unease lingered. I finished pumping the gas and walked back toward the store. As I approached the door, I noticed something strange. A cold breeze was blowing from within, though there were no windows open. It wasn't normal. I hesitated before pushing the door open again. Inside, the clerk wasn't at the counter anymore. Instead, there was a young woman standing by the register. She had long, dark hair, her face pale and drawn. She was staring at me, her expression blank and unblinking. I just need to pay for the gas," I stammered, unsure of what to make of the sudden change. The woman didn't speak, just motioned toward the register. "Ugh." I approached cautiously, confused. I didn't see you come in," I said, trying to make sense of the situation. "Were you working here the whole time?" She didn't respond. I stood there for a moment, but it felt like time was stretching unnaturally. There was an oppressive silence in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I paid for the gas and turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I saw the clerk standing outside, staring at me once again. He was no longer behind the window. He was out there in front of the store, just watching. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The clerk didn't respond. He just kept staring, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he couldn't see me at all. His presence was unsettling, like something out of a nightmare. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I quickly exited the store and walked back to my car, feeling like I was being watched from all directions. As I slid into the driver's seat, I took one last glance at the gas station. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an eerie glow over the place. I started the car and pulled out of the station, eager to leave. As I drove down the highway, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. The gas station seemed to grow smaller and smaller, fading into the distance. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The clerk, he was standing at the edge of the highway, watching me from the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes and swerved, nearly losing control of the car. My heart was racing as I glanced back at the spot where I'd just seen him. But there was no sign of anyone. The road was empty. What the hell just happened? I tried to rationalize it, but the gnawing feeling of fear wouldn't go away. I told myself I had just been tired and overthinking everything. It was nothing, just a weird encounter. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. For the next few days, the incident kept bothering me. I couldn't shake the image of the clerk staring at me from the window or the woman who had replaced him inside the store. Something about the way she looked at me, so detached and emotionless, made my skin crawl. And then I started hearing things. Quiet whispers late at night, just on the edge of my hearing. I'd turn around, but no one would be there. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was like a low murmur, as if someone was speaking just beyond my reach. One night, the whispers grew louder. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the room cold and dark. I could hear the whispers more clearly now, coming from somewhere close, like they were right outside my door. My pulse quickened as I crept toward the sound. I opened the door, and there, standing in the hallway, was the woman from the gas station. She was staring at me, just like she had at the register. "I didn't mean to frighten you," she said in a hollow voice. Her words didn't seem to come from her mouth, but rather from all around me. "Well, what do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached out a cold hand and touched my shoulder. Her touch sent a shock through me, icy and unnatural. My body went rigid. "Don't go back to that place," she whispered. Before I could say anything, she vanished. Just like that. The next morning, I packed my things and left town without a second thought. I didn't want to know any more about the gas station, the clerk, or the strange woman. I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was tied to that place, something that had followed me. I'm never going back to that highway, and I pray that whatever I encountered there, whatever it was that haunted that gas station, stays far away from me.
Next story.
It was one of those nights where the wind howled through the trees, making the silence feel almost unnatural. I had been driving for hours on an isolated stretch of road, the kind where there are no streetlights, no houses, just endless, dark woods on both sides of the highway. My gas gauge was on empty, and I was desperate to find a place to stop before my car sputtered to a halt. I had passed a few rundown buildings and old barns, but nothing that looked like a proper gas station. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. The faint glow of lights in the distance. I squinted through the windshield and saw a small, rundown gas station sitting on the side of the road, looking like it had been there for decades. The neon sign above the pump flickered, casting an eerie green light across the lot. I pulled in, relieved to finally find somewhere to fuel up. The station was dark, save for the faint light from the sign. It seemed abandoned, empty, except for a single car parked near the entrance. I didn't see anyone around, but I figured it was late and the attendant might be inside. I got out of the car, feeling the cold bite of the night air. There was a faint smell of gasoline mixed with something else, something strange. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed the bell above it was broken, hanging crookedly from a rusty nail. When I opened it, a loud screech echoed through the small space, sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, the place was dark, the air stale and thick with dust. Shelves were half empty, most of them covered in a layer of grime. A few lights buzzed overhead, but they were dim, barely illuminating the room. I couldn't see anyone behind the counter, but the faint sound of movement came from the back of the store. "Hello?" I called out, stepping further into the room. There was no answer. I glanced over at the register, where a dirty old cash register sat. Something about the place felt wrong. Maybe it was the overwhelming silence or the strange way the lights flickered. But I had no choice. I needed gas, and I didn't want to risk driving further into the night without it. I walked toward the counter and rang the bell. There was a long pause, and then from the back, a man appeared. He looked strange, like he didn't belong in the world outside this station. His clothes were mismatched. An old faded jacket that didn't look like it belonged to him, dirty boots, and a grim expression on his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me as if he was sizing me up. I felt a cold chill spread through my chest, but I tried to keep my composure. "I'm just here to pay for the gas," I said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly walked over to the register and started to ring me up. As he did, I noticed something strange. His hands were shaking and his movements seemed unnatural, almost robotic. He seemed like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. I looked around the store again, my eyes drawn to an old dusty newspaper on the counter. The date on it was from a few years ago, but the headline caught my attention. It read, "Local gas station closed after unsolved disappearances." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Was this the same gas station? Could it have been? Before I could ask the man behind the counter, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A sound coming from the back of the store, like someone crying out in pain. I turned toward the noise, but the man at the counter didn't seem to hear it. He kept ringing me up, oblivious to the sounds that were now growing louder. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, and my heart started to race. I looked back at the man, but his face had changed. His expression was now twisted, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You don't want to go back there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to act calm, but my body was already on edge. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Before he could respond, the store door slammed open, sending a gust of cold air into the room. A figure stepped inside, a woman. Her hair was matted with dirt, and her clothes were torn and stained. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, like someone who had been lost for far too long. She stepped toward the counter slowly, and I could hear her raspy breathing as she got closer. The man behind the counter didn't seem to react, but I could feel the tension in the room building. It felt as though something was about to break. "I told you not to come back here," the man said in a low, strained voice. His eyes darted to the woman, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his expression. The woman's eyes met mine, and I froze. There was something in them, something hollow and desperate. She reached out with a trembling hand and pointed toward the back of the store. "You have to leave," she whispered. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. It was as if the air around me had thickened, weighing me down, holding me in place. The man behind the counter didn't speak again, but his eyes kept darting back and forth between me and the woman, as if waiting for something to happen. The sound of muffled footsteps echoed from the back of the store like someone was approaching. Then, without warning, a door slammed open. Another man stepped out, a tall figure with a face so pale it looked like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and he grinned at me in a way that made my skin crawl. "We don't want you here," he said in a voice that was too calm, too steady. I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rushed out, I could feel the cold air behind me, the sensation of being followed, like something was right on my heels. I jumped into my car and slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station was still there, but now, I swear, I saw movement inside. The flicker of shadows, the figures of people standing in the windows, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and when I finally did, I found out something that made my blood run cold. That gas station? It hadn't been open in years. It was abandoned. It had been the site of several disappearances over the last few decades, but no one had ever found out what happened to the people who went missing. And after that night, I knew why.
Next story.
I've never believed in ghosts. Not really. I've heard the stories, sure. People talking about haunted houses, creepy old hotels, places that are known to be cursed. I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations and too many horror movies. But that was before the night I stopped at the gas station. That was before I saw her. I was driving late one evening, headed back to the city after a long week of work in the countryside. I had barely gotten halfway through my trip when my car started sputtering, the engine making a sound like it was choking. The fuel gauge was on empty, and there was nothing but darkness around me. No streetlights, no signs of life. It was just me, my car, and a long stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. I finally saw it, a lone gas station off in the distance, lights flickering, almost like a beacon. It looked old, run down even. But I didn't care. I needed gas, and I wasn't going to risk running out in the middle of nowhere. I pulled up to the pump, and the station seemed deserted. The sign was barely visible. with only a few letters still lit up. I could hear the faint hum of the lights above me and the occasional rattle of the old building, but otherwise, it was eerily quiet. I thought it was strange that there weren't any cars around, especially considering how much of a lifeline this station seemed to be for anyone traveling down this desolate highway. But I figured it was just late, maybe too late for anyone else to stop. As I filled my tank, I glanced around, noticing the windows of the station were covered with grime, and the door was propped open. It was weird, but nothing that made me feel too uncomfortable. I just wanted to get back on the road. Then I heard something. At first, it was just a faint whisper, like the wind stirring something, but as I focused, I could make out words. "Help me." I froze, looking around. There was no one in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know whether to go inside to check or just leave. But then something drew me to the door. The voice, it was almost like it was calling to me, soft, pleading. I walked slowly toward the entrance, my heart racing. I stopped in front of the open door, and that's when I saw her. A woman, standing just inside the station, her back turned to me. She was tall, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a faded white dress that looked like it came from another time. The fabric was torn and stained, and her bare feet were caked in dirt. I opened my mouth to ask if she needed help, but before I could speak, she turned around. Her face was pale, almost sickly white, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. Her lips were cracked like she hadn't spoken in years. And then I saw it. A deep red stain around her neck. It looked like a handprint, the kind of mark you'd expect from a strangulation. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could turn around and run, she spoke again. "Help me, please." I froze again, a cold shiver running down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Something in her voice, the way she looked at me, it was like she wasn't just asking for help. She was begging me for something else, something darker. The air around me grew thick, heavy. It was almost suffocating. My mind screamed for me to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The woman took a slow step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the old floor, and then another step, and another. She was coming closer. "Please," she whispered again, her voice hoarse and desperate. I don't know what happened next. It was like the world around me distorted, like time itself was slowing down. The lights above flickered erratically, casting strange, twisting shadows across the station. The woman was closer now, just a few feet away. I could feel her presence, something cold and unnatural. I couldn't look away from her face, from those hollow eyes that seemed to pull me in. I finally snapped out of it. My body moved on its own, shoving past the door, and I ran back to my car as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I scrambled to get in, slamming the door shut and locking it. I looked out the window expecting to see the woman standing there, but she was gone. The station was just still, quiet, like nothing had ever happened. I started the engine and sped off, my heart still racing. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of highway behind me. When I finally made it home, I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, maybe a little too rattled from the long drive. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that hollow, empty stare, the blood stain around her neck. The next day, I tried to find that gas station again. I remembered the exact spot where I'd pulled over, the exact turnoff. But when I drove back to that stretch of road, there was nothing, no station, just empty highway, fields, and trees. I drove up and down that road for hours, convinced I was missing something. But it was like the station had never existed. I even stopped to ask a few locals if they knew of it, but no one had heard of it. No one had ever seen it. I couldn't explain it, and I still can't. But here's the thing. A week later, I was sitting at home, scrolling through social media, when I saw a news article. It was about a woman found dead in a gas station. The report said she had been strangled. Her body was discovered years ago, decades actually. But the case had never been solved. No one had ever been caught. The description was eerily familiar. The woman had been wearing a torn white dress. Her hair had been long and dark, and her body had been found in a gas station on the outskirts of town. I never went back to that stretch of highway. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget what I saw or the voice that called out to me from the darkness. Some things, some places, just shouldn't be disturbed. I should have kept driving that night, but I didn't. And now she's still out there waiting for the next person who stops for gas.